So am I still live or am I dead? Okay, I'm still live. All right.
or ability to help you out. One thing that I don't love very much is the frequency of which random pawns will walk up to you and force you into a conversation all the frickin' time. It became so common on my first playthrough that I got so extremely annoyed that I started
No, don't do
murdering
it.
pawns left and right for having the gall to look at me. Leave me the alone. God, you know what? These pawns are actually way too similar
Eat.
to players than I give them credit for. They're really that annoying. Then again, random pawns do actually engage with enemies you're fighting, so they can act like backup from time to time, so they're not all bad. Also, you can throw them like sacks of potatoes, which is also a viable tactic. And while we're on the
Nice.
subject of combat, let's talk about it for a moment, yeah? First of all, this game is all about the combat and the big boss fights. Don't let anybody tell you any different. Sure, there is a story and there are characters, both of which we'll get to later in the video, but really, aside from the unique pawn system, the combat is most definitely the main draw of this franchise. And as someone
Hmm.
who adored DD1's combat, I can wholeheartedly say that I don't think Itsuno and his team could have found a way to make combat better than it is in DD2. Yes, I really think it's that good, specifically when you're fighting the bigger enemies. And even if you're fighting goblins
I
or
mean, it kind
bandits
of
and
looks
other
good
smaller
too.
enemies, there's just something that
I don't know
feels
what.
right about swinging a massive sword or axe around and clocking some creature right in the noggin and seeing them take off like a baseball.
Damn, that is pretty badass. Then the bitch flying.
It's just so gratifying that it's managed to keep me hooked for hours and hours, and it's even better when you're facing off against the bosses. I mean, stabbing a big cyclops through its skull for massive damage is so incredibly satisfying, and it gave me a similar feeling as to something like Dark Souls or Elden Ring when you finally beat that boss after your
What? That's nowhere near close, man. All you do with Dark Souls, you do just dodge roll, dodge roll, dodge roll, and then you just freaking attack him once, and then you rinse and repeat, dodge roll, dodge roll. You don't do anything like this in Dark Souls at all. Oolong, in Oolong, you can do something like this in a specific boss. You remember, Gosh? If you're still here, in Oolong, there is a one specific mechanic you can do in a boss like this. Do you remember that
its
fight?
skull for massive damage is so incredibly satisfying, and it gave me a similar feeling as to something like Dark
Dark Souls? They gotta freaking compare this to
Souls
Dark
or
Souls,
Elden
aren't
Ring
they?
when you finally beat that boss
It's
after
just a freaking instant trigger button for me. Anyone that mentions to freaking Dark Souls, I will just instantly get triggered.
your 10th try. Really, I think Capcom could have done away with the story, the characters, and other fluff and just called this fantasy monster killing game, and it would have still sold like hotcakes. That's
Really?
just how good, responsive, and satisfying the combat itself
Oh, I gotta
is.
play
And the best
this.
part is that every class in the game feels very distinct and different from one another. So whenever you
I don't know
start
when
to
the
grow
fuck yeah,
tired
I'm
of a
gonna play
certain
this.
moveset or playstyle,
You'll
you
see.
just hop on over to another vocation. The best part about the combat
I'm not gonna
specifically
play
are
full price of
obviously
this
the
piece of shit.
finishers and maester abilities.
I
These
heard
are
it's
the
very
ultimate
bare
skill of
bones.
any vocation, and you have to actively seek out vocation masters to learn these. Not that it's hard to do, but some of these you have to put more work into than others to get, like the
Yeah, that
Archer's
sounds
Heavenly
tedious.
Shot, where you need to have a high enough affinity with the leader of the elves to unlock it. But once you do unlock it, woof, I straight up got addicted to using this in every encounter after unlocking it.
Damn.
It's pretty much the same situation with every other Maester ability. They're a really good reward for that class fantasy, and I've seldom felt that type of power up in other games, at least
Is
in
that
terms
your
of raw
after image? Is
progression.
that your
Oh, and don't
stand?
get me started on Meteoron, which is by far my favorite magic spell in any game ever.
Not let down your guard, even for a moment.
That is kinda cool.
Now, as we're still on the topic of fighting things, we really should talk about a pretty big topic among critics of this game, and that's the enemy variety, or lack thereof. And well, I
Oh,
agree for the most part that there
Red
is some
Bozo.
serious lack of interesting encounter design after you reach a certain point in the game. That being, well, pretty much the whole game. Now, don't get me wrong, the big bosses you find on various parts of the map are all very fun to fight, like the Cyclops, Minotaurs, Ogres, Griffins, and Drakes. The thing is, goblins, humans, stone lizards, and harpies are the main enemy forces you'll be eliminating as you trek through Vermund and Batal, and well, it gets pretty tiring pretty quickly. It gets especially bad once you reach Batal, whereupon you'll be assaulted by monsters every 10 feet or so, and at times it feels like you're constantly swamped no matter what you do. And to be perfectly frank with you, this whole area made me think for a moment that Capcom just couldn't find anything super interesting to add to this region, so they just filled it up with filler monsters to make you not think about slogging through another countryside on your way to the next
Oh
chapter
wow,
of the game.
where do we see that frames done before? Probably not Elden Ring. Because that game is the best game ever made. They never use their bosses, even in their DLC.
Story. Now, don't misunderstand, I think Batal is pretty cool. There are definitely some interesting encounters there, but just like
How
with
many times?
Vermont
I wonder how many times you fight the dragon in Elden Ring. Somebody gotta count that.
and the Volcanic Isle,
Yeah?
these are very few and far
Somebody count
between.
that.
Say, for example, Medusa, who you can find in a specific cave in the southwest section of
There
the
is
top,
one
and
dragon
killing
that's
her
actually
through
remotely
decapitation grants you
different.
her
Bale, and
pet,
then
which
there
you
is
can
another
then use
guy.
to turn enemies to stone. Now
Never
that's what
mind.
I call
There
a
is two.
cool enemy. It's the same story with the Sphinx, but instead of greeting you with hostility, she challenges you through riddles, which is a really novel idea in of itself. The only thing that I didn't like very much about the riddles, though, is that one where you have to remember where you found your first Seeker token. Yeah, screw that one. Other than these two and some other encounters during the endgame, the game is unfortunately filled with
Ooh, that
pretty
looks
much
like
the
a spoiler.
same enemies over and over. And as much as I enjoy stabbing 30 Cyclopses through the head, it does get pretty stale after a while, even if you're just going through the main story and want to get to the end of the game. The strange thing is that DD2 is actually missing several of the previous monsters DD1 had, like the Cockatrice, which, to be fair, was mostly just a reskin of the Griffin. Still, there's also the Vile Eye, the Living Armor, and several others that were introduced in Dark Arisen that simply just didn't make it to DD2. Now, it would be understandable if you wanted to introduce a slew of new monsters to the game, but unfortunately, most of the enemy types are pretty much the exact same as in DD1. And aside from the repetitive nature of fighting the same enemies in the sequel game, another problem is that DD2 has a much bigger map than DD1, which exacerbates the issue where enemies start feeling much more repetitive.
Ooh, that looks
As
like
Itsuno and his
Ubisoft.
team now had to fill up an even bigger map with even more of the same encounters, which causes even more friction among players when looking back at his previous statement of building your game around fun encounters to make things interesting. DD2 could simply have done with much more enemy variety because as it is currently, running around fighting the same enemies over and over gets incredibly tiring and frankly, boring after a while. Anyway, back to some of the things that I do like. I really like some of the armors and outfits in the game for, well, pretty obvious reasons. Yeah, I mean,
Hey,
do I
that's a
really have to
default game
explain this to you?
armor? Oh
Yeah,
my
I don't think
god.
so. Oh, and as if we really need to talk about it that much, the character creation in DD2 is probably the best in terms of raw possibility in the entire
Jesus
gaming
Christ.
industry. Yeah, said it. DD2 has and still probably will have the most advanced character creator for years to come.
That looks
I mean, did you
amazing.
see the amount of fan creations that were made before the game launched? You can often create almost one-to-one copies of actual people out there,
Is
and
that
it's scary how
Asmongold?
much effort Itsuno and his devs put into only the
Is that
character creation.
Asmongold?
I probably spent at least 10 hours alone on only
That's
making
Geralt right
characters
there,
before
straight
the
up.
game came out. That's how good it is. Alright, let's see. So far into this video, I've praised the pawns, the combat, and abilities, some very cultured armor sets, and character creation. So far, the only thing I haven't really touched on are...
Sorry?
Oh, right. The story and the
Yep,
characters.
there it is.
Okay, so it probably comes off to no surprise that I've got plenty to say about these aspects of the game, as story,
Does it suck?
narrative, and
I think it
characters are
sucks.
very important to me. I mean, this is an RPG after all.
Oh,
yes?
fuck, my
So
stream got
starting off,
resetted.
I
God
do
damn
enjoy
it.
the political intrigue that the game throws you into at the start of the game. You rise to the occasion against the dragon and claim your throne as the leader of Vermund, only for you to get deposed by mysterious forces and then forced into servitude on a faraway island. The game actually spends a good deal of build-up and political plotting and scheming where you have to do stuff like infiltrate Vernworth Castle and other investigative things to find out the truth behind the plot to depose you. Unfortunately, most of these missions are pretty lackluster mechanically speaking, and infiltrating the
That was
castle is
kind of
no
fun,
harder
to be
than just
honest.
waltzing right into the ruling chambers, despite being seen by literally 10 guards or so on your way in. Suffice it to say,
Kill
the
them all.
AI outside the pawn system is hilariously bad at times. Anyway, there are some characters here that look like they had some real potential, like that of Wilhelmina, who saves you at least a couple of times in the main story and even makes out with you. And she has some pretty
Oh,
well-designed cinematics and
W.
everything. And so you'd hope that at least there will be some more story to this character, that perhaps there is some sort of payoff to her arc or something to that effect. Well, no. After helping you out the second time, she pretty much has no role in the story after that. Actually,
Oh,
that's the
Riposo.
fate of most of the cast in this game. At some point, every character just becomes irrelevant in one way or another, except for a few characters like Sven the Boy King. Honestly, the best way I can describe the story structure of DD2 is that it's
Bad.
half-baked. The characters are half-baked, and the plot itself is also half-baked, like a pizza with too much dough and too little filling. Now that said, what I really love about Dragon's Dogma is the concept and the dynamic of the Arisen, their pawn and the dragon. Despite its flaws, DD1 still had a really cool twist at the end where it's actually revealed that the Arisen is essentially getting groomed to become the new Seneschal, or god, through the trial of facing Grigori, the dragon. In DD2, it's essentially the same thing, but with an added twist of the actual god, seemingly, that being the Pathfinder, or this ghosty guy who keeps telling you what to do, being the real villain all along. Now the thing is, as much as I liked the past twist in the first game, I was actually hoping for Capcom to do something entirely new with the story, but it just ends up being mostly the same thing, except for one key element. You see, when you beat the
Wait,
final
it
boss of
basically plays like
DD1,
Dragon's
that being
Dogma
the
1, but
Seneschal,
better
or the current
graphics?
god of the world, you end up
The
taking their
story?
place as the new Seneschal. Then, when you start up your New Game Plus and make it to the end, well, turns out that your previous Arisen that you created is now the god you have to defeat in order to take their place, which was
Yeah.
just so mind-bendingly cool. And it set up
Yeah,
this
that is
idea of a
cool.
perfect cycle that has no beginning and has no end. Now, what Dragon's Dogma 2 does is that it actually lets you break out of said cycle by defeating the Pathfinder, which essentially frees the world from the Dragon's Dogma. And you know, that's cool and all, but does it lead to any cool new things in New Game Plus? No, it doesn't
Nope.
do anything in terms of what DD1 did. You don't get any special encounter, you don't get to face your previous Arisen, nothing like that at all, meaning that DD2 yet again lost another ingredient that made the first one so charming and special. Again, it's like the ending wasn't thought through entirely, it's yet again half-baked. And this very much extends to New Game Plus, because as I just mentioned, New Game Plus doesn't actually change the ending or do anything new for your new playthrough. Hell,
Yeah.
there aren't any higher difficulty levels than normal, and enemies don't get any more challenging than they already are. So if you went through all the effort of finding all the cool weapons and armor in the endgame version of the map, that being the unmoored world,
I
get
just
ready
don't
to
I just don't get it. Like, and why do people just replay the same game over again? I don't know. Like I just can't imagine why they do that. Like it can't it doesn't compute. It doesn't compute to Alexa can't compute to that. Like why don't you play the same game once again? Isn't your journey is over? Isn't it time for you to move on and find something else? I don't know, man. Give me a second. I don't know. I guess it's not my it's not for me. Like, I usually play, no matter how good I am in the game, I will be good. I will play till I get good, I guess. But as soon as I finish the game, I just lose every interest on that game. That's it. That's it. Like, it's done. I can't cover it. You know? So what's the point? I don't know. Even with the freaking Elden Ring, I'm not gonna play that game again. Ever. I'm just done. Time for me to find another one. You know, that's how I do things, I guess.
Destroy most enemies with even fewer attacks than before, with a bonus of no extra content or challenge to make another playthrough interesting or rewarding. Again, I hate to return to this word, but there really isn't any other word that perfectly describes this, but New Game Plus is yet another element of Dragon's Dogma 2 that's just honestly half-baked. Obviously, it makes sense for a game such as this to have New Game Plus, but when it doesn't actually bring anything new to the table, then what's the point? And this brings us to what's in store for this franchise as of today. What about DLC? Expansions? Are there even plans for another Dragon's Dogma in the future? Well, that's a very good question.
So.
Honestly, I personally think it's a given that this game should at least get one expansion that can improve on the experience as a whole, sort of what Dark Arisen did for the original game. The problem is, Hideaki Itsuno is no longer working at Capcom, as he officially resigned pretty recently to work on a new game with another studio. This doesn't mean that there won't be future content for the game, as Dark Arisen wasn't led by Itsuno back in the glory days. And by looking at Capcom's own statements, Dragon's Dogma 2 sold well over expectations. So much so that they were able to pay out more money to their shareholders, according to this IGN article.
Yeah, I think it is a pretty gotten popular, but people just, it was so bad. You know? At least that's the word of mouth is. No? People say this game is bad.
Back in
I gotta play it myself.
April of 2024.
I was never a fan of the damn, what's the name? Dragon's Dogma 1. Because the game really doesn't tell you jack shit. And it is as an open world, so you gotta go around and talk to every NPC, which was kind of annoying for me. I just don't like it. Like, straight up. Like, make your own story and you have to talk to every NPC. That's like a game from 1998 plays like that. You know? That doesn't work on a modern open world game. Like, come on. So I just hated that. Like, you know?
Look, at the end of the
I
day,
just don't
I
like
think
it.
the Dragon's Dogma
It was so boring. You know? For me, at least. I hope this game kind of fixed
The
that.
franchise
Maybe.
has tremendous potential, and I wish Itsuno and his team had done many things differently, because what we ended up with was a game that ironically took a few steps back from its predecessor, and along the way it feels like Dragon's Dogma 2 is just less special than the first one, despite being mechanically better in so many other ways. Honestly, I adore Dragon's Dogma 2, but I'm also really annoyed by it, and anytime I think back on my first playthrough, I remember how disappointed I felt at times, because while I was really impressed at some parts of the game, other parts made me groan in frustration and boredom. And as someone who was extremely excited for this release, it just bums me out that this game is in this weird gray zone where you like it, but you also want it to be better. And you know it can be better, but we still don't know what Capcom is planning for it and whether they have any plans at all. And so
yeah, this should have been, at least that's what Asmongold said. Should have been a game. It should have been a Elden Ring with a good story, you know? And then turned out it to be a dud.
Trying to say that
I'm massive dud.
worried that this franchise will be put on ice before long. And I really hope it doesn't, because again, Dragon's Dogma has tremendous potential, and I think it's high time Capcom realized that.
That scene looks
Perhaps
cool.
They already have. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, remember to stick around by subscribing, and let me know your thoughts as always in the comments below. This has been Mr. Holton.
I like to see my character in the cutscene. It's super fun. Like, that's the only redeeming factor about Monster Hunter. You know, in Monster Hunter, if you make your custom character, almost every cutscene, your character will show up on there. It's super fun to look at it.